You smell it before you see anything. Something sweet and thick and wrong, pushing through lead seams like it has somewhere to be. The kind of smell that makes the guards step back before they understand why. You feel the cold next. February stone. The kind that soaks through boot leather and into bone. The abbey has no heating. It hasn't had nuns to tend the fires in 8 years. Now look down. There's a crack running along the base of the coffin. A lid seam split by pressure from the inside. Something dark pools on the floor, spreading toward the altar steps. And then you hear it. Claws on stone. A dog. Then another. Through a door someone left unlatched. No one stops them. No one is awake. It's 3 in the morning. February 14th, 1547. Syon Abbey, Middlesex. And what happens next will take less than 6 hours. 6 hours that will make a prophecy spoken to a king's face 15 years earlier come literally, physically true. The coffin belongs to Henry VIII, the man who declared himself God's representative on earth, broke a 1,000-year church, and dissolved 800 monasteries. Right now, strays are licking his remains off the stone floor of a monastery he took from nuns. It sounds like fiction. It isn't. This is what multiple Tudor-era chroniclers recorded as the final chapter in the life of Henry VIII. This wasn't an anomaly. This was routine in Tudor England, a kingdom where the king owned God, and God's houses were inventory to be liquidated. Most retellings stop at the wives, the costumes, the romance. They never follow what happened after. And what happened after is the part you don't forget. Welcome to Unleashed Secrets, where we dig into the truths history tried to bury. You've heard of Henry VIII. You think you know this story. The 6 wives, the church, the tyranny. You don't. Not yet. This isn't the version you've heard. What follows comes from Tudor court dispatches, from chroniclers who walked alongside the funeral cortege, and from the objects that survived when the portraits lied. By the end of this, you'll know 3 things most people never learn. First, what a Franciscan friar said directly to Henry's face that got him expelled from England, and how every word came true 15 years later. Second, the rational, documented machinery Henry built to justify the largest property seizure in English history, and why understanding its logic is more disturbing than any portrait of madness. Third, the detail about Henry's burial that is so grotesque, so perfectly ironic, that it reads like punishment scripted by someone who despised him. If this is the kind of history you want, stay with us. Subscribe. This is the story of how a king who called himself God's voice on earth ended up on the floor of a stolen monastery, and how a prophecy he tried to erase outlived him. To understand how Henry ended up on that floor, you need to understand how impossibly high he started. In 1509, a 17-year-old prince was crowned King of England, and Europe didn't know what hit it. Foreign ambassadors sent dispatches home describing Henry in terms that sound invented. The most handsome ruler in Christendom. 6'2" when men averaged 5'7". Athletic. Red gold hair to his shoulders. 4 languages. Music still performed 5 centuries later. Every court in Europe wrote home the same thing. England's new king might be the most impressive human being alive. In 1521, Henry wrote a theological treatise defending papal supremacy against Martin Luther. The Pope personally granted him the title Fidei Defensor, Defender of the Faith. That title, FD, still appears on every British coin today. Check your pocket. The man who would burn Catholic authority in England was decorated by the Pope for defending it. And Henry believed it. He was not a cynical operator using religion as a prop. By every account, he was a man of genuine theological conviction. He believed God had chosen him. When he broke with Rome, he didn't think he was destroying the church. He thought he was purifying it. That belief is what made everything that followed not just possible, but righteous. Here's what makes Henry more disturbing than any simple tyrant. He had reasons, good ones, documented ones. And if you follow his logic step by step, you'll find yourself agreeing. And that's exactly the problem. The monasteries of England were not, by 1535, paragons of devotion. Henry's chief minister Thomas Cromwell commissioned a full audit. The commissioners reported real problems: abbots living like aristocrats, vows routinely broken, charitable obligations ignored. Some of it was real, some of it wasn't. That didn't matter. Henry's argument wasn't, "I want their money," though he did. It was, "These places have betrayed God, and I'm the only one who can fix it." This wasn't cruelty. This was theology with a budget spreadsheet. Let's call what Henry built what it was: sacred arithmetic, faith reduced to numbers, devotion measured in property value, salvation administered through ledgers. The machine was bureaucratic. And a system like this doesn't feel evil. It feels official. And that's worse. Every monastery door that closed with a clerk's signature. The machine didn't need to be cruel. It just needed to be thorough. Here's the shift. This is where argument becomes power. It's November 3rd, 1534. A single act passes through Parliament, the Act of Supremacy. One sentence reshapes a civilization. The king is now the supreme head of the Church of England. Before this parchment, Henry is a king who argues with the Pope. After it, he is the Church. Disagreement becomes treason. The Treasons Act, passed the same session, makes it a capital offense to deny the king's supremacy, not in action, in words. You can die for a sentence spoken at dinner. Think about that. Under this system, a private thought carries the same weight as armed rebellion. This was policy. This was infrastructure. This was law. And anyone who resisted would meet the arithmetic face to face. But here's what Henry didn't anticipate. 2 years before Parliament handed him the church, someone had already told him exactly where this road would end. Easter, 1532. A Franciscan friar named William Peto climbs into the pulpit of the Chapel Royal at Greenwich, looks directly at the King of England, and compares him to King Ahab. Ahab, the Old Testament tyrant whose death the prophet Elijah foretold. The dogs would lick his blood. Peto said it to Henry's face, in front of the entire court. The dogs would lick his blood as they had licked Ahab's. Remember that. No army, no title, no protection. Just a friar in a pulpit, telling the most powerful king in Europe exactly how his story ends. Henry's answer? Erase the warning. Peto was expelled from England. Thomas More chose a different weapon: silence. Henry's Lord Chancellor, his closest intellectual friend, he simply refused to sign the Act of Supremacy. Henry had him beheaded. July 6, 1535. More's final words. He died the king's good servant, but God's first. His head stood on London Bridge for a month. His daughter bribed the bridgekeeper to take it down. The prophet shouted. The philosopher went silent. The arithmetic found them both. Imagine this is your home. Syon Abbey, November 1539. You've watched the commissioners arrive with ledgers, measuring your walls, counting your silver, listing your chapel plates like equipment being checked out of a warehouse. You've heard the dissolution read aloud in a voice that treats 4 centuries of devotion like an accounting error. You've seen your sisters leave one by one, carrying nothing. You've given this place your entire adult life. And now the machinery has reached your door, not out of malice, out of bookkeeping. The doors lock behind you. The lead comes off the roof within weeks. The library, one of the finest in England, scattered or burned. You know, walking away, that you will never come back. 8 years later, the man who signed your eviction would be carried through those same doors, in a box, and no one would be left to pray for his soul. The dissolution of the monasteries between 1536 and 1541 was the largest state-directed property seizure in English history. Over 800 religious houses dismantled, one every 2 days for 5 straight years. They owned massive parts of England, and the paperwork reads like corporate correspondence. It was normal now. But monasteries weren't just places of prayer. If you were sick, if you were hungry, if you had nowhere to go, you went to a monastery, and now they were gone. Not every abbot went quietly. Richard Whiting, abbot of Glastonbury, refused to surrender. They dragged him to the top of Glastonbury Tor, the hill overlooking his own abbey, and hanged, drew, and quartered him. He was over 80. The king who wrote a book defending God's sacraments executed an old man for practicing them. And when the monasteries vanished, Parliament didn't replace them. It criminalized the people they'd fed. And then, his own body failed him. Henry VIII dies on January 28, 1547, at Whitehall Palace. He is 55. His final suit of armor, still preserved at the Royal Armories, tells the story his portraits tried to hide. A waist of 54 inches, up from 32 in his youth. The armor doesn't lie. The paintings do. His will is specific. A tomb at Windsor beside Jane Seymour. Marble, bronze, gilded angels, a monument to eclipse every royal burial in Europe. On February 14th, the funeral cortege, 4 miles of black-draped procession, stops for the night at Syon Abbey. The same floor, the same building, now holding him. What happens next shows up in source after source. Different writers, same ending. Maybe not every detail, same ending. The lead splits. 2 weeks of decomposition gases in a sealed container housing a body of extraordinary mass. The pressure has nowhere to go. The seams crack. Something dark spreads across the stone. By morning, the doors are still open. No one stopped them. The strays are inside. According to the chroniclers, they reach what's left of England's most powerful king on the floor of that same abbey. The friar's words land 15 years late, not as metaphor, not as theology, as fact. But the irony didn't stop there. It was just getting started. Henry's son, Edward, the heir he shattered a civilization to produce, dies at 15, never married, never ruled as an adult. His daughter Mary restores Catholicism with fire. Nearly 300 Protestants burned in 5 years. His other daughter Elizabeth, the one he declared illegitimate, reigns for 45 years and builds an empire. She never marries, never produces an heir. When she dies in 1603, the Tudor line dies with her. Henry wanted a dynasty that would last centuries. 3 children, then gone. The church he created to serve himself outlived his bloodline by 5 centuries. He wanted a tool. He built an institution that forgot about him. And Peto, the friar he expelled, survived, outlived Henry, outlived Edward. Under Mary I, he was nominated for the cardinalate. The man Henry silenced nearly became one of the most powerful voices in the Catholic Church. Here's the detail that follows you home. Henry commissioned the most magnificent tomb in English history: marble pillars, gilded bronze, a sarcophagus to rival the Renaissance popes. It was never built, not by his son, not by either daughter, not by anyone. The sarcophagus was finally used in 1808 for the tomb of Lord Nelson. His coffin? Someone else's glory. If you go to St. George's Chapel at Windsor today, you'll find gilded tombs for kings whose names you've never heard. Gold leaf, marble angels, inscriptions praising men who ruled briefly and changed nothing. And in the floor, beneath a plain black slab, Henry. You'd walk right over him without looking down. Henry VIII wanted control over his church, his wives, his theology, his body, his death, his story. He wanted to author every chapter, including the last. He got a coffin that wouldn't hold, a prophecy he couldn't kill, a tomb that was never built, a dynasty that died with a daughter who chose to end it. 6 wives, 2 beheaded, 800 monasteries stripped to the walls, 1 son dead at 15, 1 daughter who burned everything he'd built, and another, the one he rejected, who built an empire and let his bloodline die. The dogs found him on the stone floor of a house where nuns once prayed for his soul. You smell it before you see anything, something sweet and thick and wrong. He couldn't stop it, just delay it.